much, Dr. Sanchez, for taking the time to meet with us today and share a little bit more about what you do with our students. We're so excited to be including you as part of our Future Teachers Network Teacher Talk series. So if you're ready, we're going to go ahead and dive into some questions.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Wonderful. So can we start out with maybe you taking some time to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Sure. So my name's Irene Sanchez, and I teach Latino Studies. I teach Chicano Latino Studies at 3 high schools a day in the Azusa Unified School District. I'm the only ethnic studies teacher in my district. So, you know, I've seen myself as a lifelong educator. I've been teaching ethnic studies for over 10 years, if you combine when I taught college and then now teaching high school for the past 5 years. It's been an interesting journey coming to teach K-12 out of teaching college. So I've kind of done this, I wouldn't say I did it backwards. You know, journeys aren't always a straight line. So I've just taken a different route, and I always wanted to teach high school at some point. So I'm really thankful for what I do. So primary job is an educator, teacher, right? But I'm also a writer and I'm a mother. So I think all those things help me be a better teacher too.
Those are all such important roles, and I'm sure so fascinating going from the college setting to the high school environment. A big change, but rewarding nonetheless. Yeah, so could you tell us a little bit more about your educational journey after college? So how did you end up where you're at from college to high school? What was that journey like?
Oh, during K-12, I remember struggling a lot in my own journey from when we moved out here. So I grew up at first in Southeast Los Angeles. It's a city called Commerce. We moved out here to the Inland Empire, where I grew up near Riverside in a city called Hoopa Valley. And ever since then, I just remember I didn't do as well. And I always knew when I got to high school, I probably wasn't going to go straight to a 4-year. I don't know where that got embedded. There's a lot of things that happen along the way, but I knew I would end up going to community college. So after high school, I was one of those students who barely graduated. I actually was going to get kicked out of my senior year of high school to go to a continuation high school. And then I didn't. I ended up making the cut. And so then right after high school, I go to community college. And I really struggled there too that first year because I wasn't academically prepared. And just because of other things, personal issues going on at the time with family, I ended up getting academic probation and academic dismissal. So in other words, when they kick you out of community college. And a lot of times when statistics show, like later, when I was in the higher ed program for my graduate degrees for education, they would say that once someone gets kicked out on probation and dismissal, usually they don't ever come back to school. I was very fortunate that I did. And then I had a lot of really amazing and supportive people that helped me along my journey. And it was at some point there I started taking ethnic studies classes. They weren't called that at the time though. They was just kind of scattered through sociology or through history. And I ended up getting straight A's for the first time in my life when I returned. So after that, I decided I was going to major in sociology. And then I ended up transferring to the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I finished my education there for my bachelor's that I also got in Latin American Latino Studies. Then after that, I had swore I would never leave California, but you know, again, we don't know what's going to take us. I ended up going to the University of Washington in Seattle because I had said I wanted a PhD. That was another goal. Right before that, I had actually gotten into UC Santa Cruz's teacher education master's credential program. And I opted not to do it. And I stayed an extra year as a transfer student preparing to apply for a PhD. So when I look back at that, I was like, oh, I was going to go, you know, I would have been a teacher since like, you know, the mid 2000s, late 2000s, if I had done that, you know, path. But I ended up going to Washington, to Seattle, and I stayed there about 7 years and got my master's of education and my PhD, and had my son. I was a single mom back then, and it was very difficult to finish a dissertation, uh, trying to do that with a 2-year-old. And I
Wow.
returned to California. I came home. I thought I was going to go into admin, to higher ed admin. And I learned through a job that might not, maybe it was the job, maybe it was the place I was at, but that just wasn't the fit at the time for me, that path. So when my job opened up, the one I have now, it was because a teacher had left and they were trying to find someone because they were afraid that if nobody took on that position, that maybe that Latino studies class, and as it was unified, that somebody would have gotten rid of it. They would have, not had, if they don't have the teacher, then it's like, what are they going to do? So in 2017, I applied to that, and I've been there ever since. And of course, in order to keep that job, I needed my California teacher credential. So that required me going back to school, which was really interesting because, after sitting through so much schooling, it's like, I really want to go back to school. So I did get my credential, and it's clear, thankfully.
Wonderful. Wow, what a fascinating journey. Oh my goodness. It sounds like just full of ups and downs and all sorts of obstacles, but what an amazing, resilient person you must be to have triumphed over all of those obstacles. I'm sure your younger self would be so proud to see where you're at today.
I think so.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So along with that, I mean, you spoke on it a little bit, but what led you to wanting to become a teacher, from struggling academically to now having a doctorate and teaching all different types of classes? I'm sure that was a fascinating journey as well.
I think what inspired me early on is, and I think this is what inspires many people, is having amazing teachers of your own. And even though I didn't do so well, excuse me, in high school, there's still teachers I talk to from when I was in high school. We're like friends on social media and that sort of thing. And this has been, going on like 20 years. And, the two teachers that I had that really inspired me, they actually did this in the local newspaper out here. They did like a highlight of what graduating seniors wanted to do. And so I'm in that newspaper from the year 2000 with my high school English teacher and her husband, who was my economics teacher, Mr. and Mrs. Podgorski. And at first I had thought when I graduated high school, I was going to be like, we called her Mrs. P, Mr. P for Podgorski, right? And so I thought it was going to be like Mrs. P and go be like an English teacher. But, I'm more in line with like history, social studies, ethnic studies. So, I think there's a little bit of literature component to what I teach too, actually a lot. So I think it was them. I also think it was my mother. She was a bilingual aide, so a classified worker in the school system for 25 years, or roughly around there. She actually became a teacher a little bit before me. She is in her she was in her 50s when she finished her credential and her master's. And so she is a 6th grade teacher right now over at Fulton. My older sister, she's only older by a year, she is a elementary school teacher over in Rialto. And then my sister-in-law is a high school teacher over in Paris, the Paris area of California. So, it's kind of like it's all around you. And then, like I said, it was something I had wanted from before I had decided, I'm going to get a PhD. I had said, I'm going to be a teacher. Like, I want to teach high school. And I think because I saw the way, even though I didn't do that well in high school, when you have teachers who believe in you, right, or that see something in you that you don't see in yourself quite yet, I think it motivates you even more to try to, I could probably make a difference like that for a student too, And I think if it wasn't for having that experience with Mrs. P, especially my English teacher, I probably wouldn't have ended up even wanting to be a teacher.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think that truly speaks about the impact that a teacher can have, and really building those relationships can create all the difference in a a person's life. That's crazy the impact it has. So what would you say is the most rewarding part of teaching?
I think the most rewarding part of teaching is helping students, um, you know, uncover things that maybe they didn't know or that they already have, kind of like Miss P did for me. Like, a lot of these students that I deal with, all of them, but there's a particular group, they're very smart and capable and intelligent, right? And I think because of personal issues or because of environmental, things, distractions, they might get this idea in their head. I teach predominantly Latinx students. And so, I'm talking about 92% of my school's population. I work at a continuation high school. I work at 2 comprehensive high schools too. And to see sometimes, especially with my continuation high school students, that they kind of doubt themselves because of how they've performed academically previously. It's trying to get them to see, no, you are capable of doing this. You're capable of doing college level coursework already. I use college level textbooks in my class. So, and because I used to teach college, I can tell that they have the skills, it just, they need to be developed a little bit more. But as far as being intellectually capable, there's so many of them that are, but I just don't think no one's told them that before, or they just don't believe in themselves. So I think it takes a little bit of encouragement, a little extra to get them to see that in themselves, that they already have it. It's just, they have to believe it too, so that they can go forward and be like, yeah, I'm going to go to college, or I'm going to do this. And, it doesn't matter that I failed a couple times, or that, I didn't do so great, or I grew up, in this particular place, or under-resourced, trying to teach them the skills too that they will be able to use to navigate higher education, because that's a whole set of skills in itself, asking questions, talking to your professors, asking for help for financial aid, or if you get a no, being persistent and be like, no, like, I need money, like I need a scholarship, where do I find this, And so I try to do that in my class, even though, limited time. But I try to teach them those skills so that, they learn that, from somewhere.
For sure. That's so phenomenal. The impact that has of teaching all those, life skills and growth mindset kind of attributes, the confidence and resiliency and perseverance. I think that is definitely a super rewarding part of teaching. Yeah. So kind of speaking to that, could you tell us maybe some of the biggest obstacles that you see your students facing?
I see my students facing, I think, when we were just talking about, that lack of confidence, I think, is a big one. And it's sad to see. I know it's not an easy fix, because I'm just one teacher, right? And so even if you tell a student, hey, maybe you can do this, they might get the message a few other times a day that, that they can't do it, or that they're not capable, right? Or I don't even think some of them get positive feedback in terms of just their daily work. This year I had seen on, since I work at 3 high schools, I would see sometimes my students nominate me for like teacher of the year or something, right? At one of the high schools I work at, they actually give you the form for what the student wrote. And I was really surprised to see this year, one of the students who nominated me asked, or basically told, the committee, that the thing that stood out to them the most about me was that I gave them feedback on their work. And I was like, oh, well, I don't want to assign them work if I'm not going to tell them, feedback. But I guess that was something that was unusual for her, like feedback, whether it's constructive or most of the time it's positive, like, I like this, or this is great, I like your ideas. And I was like, oh, something as simple as that can really boost their confidence. And I don't know how many people realize that, or I'm like, am I really like the only teacher around, at least at that school, right? For that student, am I the only one that stands out to her for that? And And to me, it was a little sad because like, she's been there, you know, junior, she's been there 3 years. And I'm like, you know, I was really honored that she said that because again, you don't know how small of a thing that you're doing that is making a big impact on somebody else. So I would have to say that lack of confidence too. Like I said, working at the continuation high school, I had a different assignment recently where I had students do a self-evaluation, right? So how well did you do? Give me a suggestion for how many points you think you deserve on this activity, that kind of thing, right? And it was a group activity. Like, what did you contribute? And I noticed between the 3 high schools I teach at, my continuation high school students were the hardest on themselves. And I'm like, whoa, why are you giving yourselves like 5s and 6 when I went through the whole day? To be honest, my students that were at the continuation high school actually did the group activity really, really well. And I would have to say, even in some cases, it seemed like they were a little bit more productive than the other 2 high schools. So I was really shocked to see, you know, that they just, you know, feel like some of them feel kind of low on themselves, you know. So I'd have to say that. And I think it's a combination of things. I think the pandemic has been really hard on a lot of students, losing their loved ones. For quite a few of them, you know, that isolation, dealing with mental health issues. So all these big issues we see in society that impact, you know, certain communities are the same issues our students are dealing with. That's a challenge, you know, because, you know, you might be like, hey, you know, wake up, you're sleeping in class, but you know, people don't know if that student, and I usually ask, I find out, but students have jobs, you know, they're working to help support their families. At least in my classes, they're, you know, they're balancing a lot of responsibilities. And so it's just really difficult sometimes, you know, aside from the academic part, you know, low confidence is just, there's a lot, there could be a lot going on at home that maybe, you know, isn't so obvious.
That's wonderful, the way to see the ways that you are so intentional about, you know, recognizing each of those challenges and then striving your hardest to meet those to support your students. That's really inspirational to see. Thank you so much again for doing that. I know it makes a huge impact in your students' lives. So yeah, to take things in a slightly different direction, I'd love to hear a little bit about the Chicano movement and the walkouts that impacted your father's life and then your own life in turn. I've heard that made quite an impact in your family.
Yeah, so both my parents actually were born and raised in East Los Angeles. My grandparents, all 4 of them, came from Mexico at different points in time. My dad's family came post the Mexican Revolution, which was back in 1910. My mother's family came more into the 50s. And so when my parents were growing up, they're growing up at the height of the civil rights movement. Of course, the student walkouts in East LA were the height of the, you know, Chicano movement in that larger movement of the civil rights movement. And my father got to see a lot of things when he was younger. So he wasn't part of the high school that were walking out. He was actually in a middle school, in the junior high, Griffith Junior High. And so when those East LA walkouts happened at the 5 high schools that were there, including the one he ended up going to and my mother went to, Garfield, my dad was actually in junior high. He was at Griffith. So I didn't know up until that point and until later that, you know, it wasn't just the high school students who walked out. You know, afterwards, they also had, you know, their parents come, really like community support. Middle school students walked out. I heard elementary school students walked out, right? And so later when I was in middle school, my dad told me these things and I was like, whoa, because that's when I was barely learning about it from him. We were watching on PBS back then called Chicano, the History of the Mexican American Civil Rights Movement. He was like, oh yeah, I was there, right? And I'm like, okay. And I found out later he was also at another event called the Chicano Moratorium. That happened. It was more of a community march, anti-war protest. So all of those things made an impact on him. And as I've gotten older, my parents have gotten older, they share more stories about what's happened or what had happened back then. And, you know, it still impacts me because these are things that, you know, I think people should talk about, what kind of challenges they had to go through, not just, you know, again, not just as a student, right? But also growing up in a certain community, right? My dad will tell me about when he got harassed by police, you know, just for walking home, like not even for, you know, the no crimes committed, just for walking around the town. And it seems really unfair, and those injustices that were there for those students, you know, back in 68 when they did walk out, you know, the discrimination that Mexican students faced, particularly at the time, the lack of those students going on to college. I think anyone who was a part of that, you know, really opened the doors for the next generation and the next one after. And I think those things are so important to be taught in school. And so I'm honored that I get to teach those things, you know, now as a teacher. Like, these are things I focus on. So my students actually just finished learning about the walkouts and the moratorium a couple weeks ago, before our spring break. And, you know, a lot of them still didn't know, like, oh, wow, we, you know, our community did that, or like there was people out there who stood up for our rights, you know. And I think those stories are really powerful to hear, because sometimes when I teach this history of Latinos in the US, some of it seems like very you know, it's just there's a lot of bad stuff that happened. There was a lot of violence towards certain communities. There's a lot of discrimination, injustice. And so sometimes my students are like, well, wasn't there anything like positive too that came out of them? Like, yeah, look, like they opened the doors so more of us can go to college, because prior to that, there wasn't many Chicano Latino people in the, you know, in Los Angeles and California going to college. And this really changed things. So, you know, I don't think there would have been even the field of ethnic studies without what those students did in 1968. And I say that because the college movement for ethnic studies started later that year, right? So to think that this group of high school students, right, and of course, you know, people from the community, or, you know, my dad included, thousands of people walked out to demand, you know, better rights, better education, but also to demand Mexican American studies. You know, fast forward all these years, you know, we have a requirement for high school graduation now in the state of California. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out as it starts rolling out by the year 2030. But, you know, there's a lot of, it was a long road to progress, I guess, to this moment. And, you know, for my students to see like, wow, it took, even in their district, it took over 40 years for them to have a Chicano Latino studies class. I think, you know, being able to connect those dots between history, right, and the present day are super important for my students.
Yeah, that is just so cool to see the impact that has of learning the history and the challenging parts and connecting that back to their community, and really showing the positive sides too, recognizing the triumphs that the direct impacts that those movements had. So kind of along with that, I'd love to hear some interesting ways that you found that learning the Latino, Chicano history for your students, that how does it impact their lives? How does it enhance their personal experiences, would you say?
I would say it does a lot. I still talk to a lot of my former students from my first years. I know it's like, but I talk to a lot of them from, you know, year one, year two still, and they'll tell me they still remember like this class, it changed their life. We have like a family sort of environment there. And so it's interesting, you know, on days where I'm not there due to whatever, right? They'll like write me in my Google Classroom, like, where you at, miss? Like, where you go? You know, and usually I tell them they just forgot that I told them there was a sub. Yeah. But, you know, it's really great to see how they're able to connect those dots, right? Between, and that's my main goal. I mean, it's like, I could teach history, right? And we could be like, okay, so what, right? it happened. But to be able to make those connections between what's going on now in the Chicano Latino community and issues that need to be addressed still, right? And to make it that connection to the past is really important. And like I said, showing those examples are as well, not just, hey, this happened, they opened the doors, but kind of like they also have a responsibility, right? Like, okay, so we made these connections past to present, but now what are you going to do to help yourself? What are you going to do to help your family or your community, whoever you define as your family too, right? But to make things better for you, right? Because there were sacrifices made, but what are you going to do to improve your own life, right? And to improve your family's life and your community, right? And for most of them, they remember that. And it's really nice to see them display some of this knowledge that they've learned through like the projects we do. We write poems in the class, those sorts of things. And, it's always great to see them do really well after, right? Many of my students go to community college, just like I did. So, it's good to see that they move forward, even if they don't go to college, right? That they move forward in some positive way, right? They remember this stuff. And I think, because again, if there's current events happening now that are impacting us in our community, like the pandemic, right? Disproportionately impacting Latino communities, issues of healthcare access, all of these things, right? They relate back to something that's happened before. It's not like these things are brand new. And I show them that. I show them articles relating to the 1918 flu pandemic and how Mexican students were segregated in schools there in their own hometown. I use the newspapers from their hometown to show them that while that pandemic happened, Mexican students actually weren't allowed to go back to class because there was an idea that they were dirty or diseased or all of these things in history, right? There was separate Mexican schools until 1947 in California, until the decision of Mendez versus Westminster. So all of these things connect to the type of quality of education and the inequalities that still exist today. And so that's what I try to do. And I think they remember it. They remember a lot of it. And it's nice to know that years later, that they'll write still, or they'll just say hi, or that this class was the most impactful class they had in high school. And that's a real honor for me.
That must be so rewarding, to see the impacts it has on your students' lives in numerous different ways. I'm sure that really keeps you going on days that are tricky. But yeah, as we near the end of our time here, I just want to send us off with maybe a little word of advice. What could you tell someone who's pursuing a career in education? Like, what should they expect?
I think you don't know what to expect sometimes, and that's okay. I think it's really important to get to know your community that you're teaching in. So even though I identify as Chicana, Mexican American, right, I teach in a community that is predominantly Chicano Latino, but at the same time, you really got to know the population you're serving and be honest and real with who you are and where you're coming from so that they know. And I think that builds trust, right? I always believe in, for me, even though I'm an adult, right, I give respect and I'll get it, right? I need them to respect me first. I need to gain their trust. I need to gain their respect. And so part of that is just being honest who I am, what I'm doing, right? My background. And I feel connecting with them in that way has opened it up where, there is that mutual respect. And I think once that happens and you build that environment, that's when the real learning can take place.
Yeah, those relationships and building trust are so important. I would have to agree. Well, thank you so much again for your time with us today, Dr. Sanchez. I know I learned so much, and I know all our students back home watching this are going to just gain such valuable wisdom from you and your experience.
Yes, thank you for having me.